Welcome to What is Going for new thought from the edge of Each week on OMTimes flagship radio show, veteran broadcaster, author, and media consultant Sandie Sedgbeer conducts thought-provoking interviews with inspirational authors, artists, musicians, scientists, speakers, and filmmakers who are working at the point where spirituality and science meet consciousness at the very edge of Here is your host, Sandie Sedgbeer.
Hello. Proof of spiritual phenomena. If that's what you've been seeking, stay tuned, because joining me today is a cognitive neuroscientist who prided herself on being an aggressive defender of the dogma of scientific beliefs, until a series of life-altering events caused her to reconsider spirituality and psi concepts and launched her on a 2-year investigation into the ineffable mysteries of our world. An investigation that culminated in the publication of her first book, Proof of Spiritual Phenomena, a neuroscientist's discovery of the ineffable mysteries of the universe. A former research scientist at the University of Southern California, Mona Sobhani holds a doctorate in neuroscience from the University of Southern California, and she completed a post-doctoral fellowship at Vanderbilt University with the MacArthur Foundation Law and Neuroscience Project. Her work has been featured in the New York Times, Vox, and other media outlets. And she joins me now to share elements of her investigations and discuss the Psychedelic Renaissance and consciousness, along with other highlights from her Brave New World of Psychedelic Science newsletter. Mona Sobhani, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be speaking with you.
So early in your book, you state that the old you would have hated the new you. Tell us a bit about that old you, who you were, what your upbringing was like, and why you were agnostic, and what changed all that.
Yeah. I was just a very typical, what I considered to be a typical hard-nosed, skeptical scientist. In the book, I talk about scientific materialism is the kind of philosophical paradigm that modern science follows, believing that everything in the world is physical matter and that's all that exists. And I definitely subscribe to that because that's what they teach you. That's how they train you in normal science. And in neuroscience in particular, which is my field, they go the extra mile and teach you that your brain, it can be, obviously this is dramatic, but it can be a bit deceptive to you and your behavior. So our brains, take in a lot of information. They can't take in and process everything. So it kind of filters what you take in by your beliefs, like what you believe in, your past experiences, what you're expecting, and it tries to predict the future. So a lot of things that we think we see or hear or our memories can be really off, or they're through our own personal filters. And so in neuroscience, it kind of train you to understand that, and that your brain is not always trustworthy. We can't always trust our perceptions, that a lot of things in human history that were deemed mystical or magical eventually ended up having an explanation in hard physical science. And that the things that we can't yet explain, one day we will be able to explain with science. And so I think by the time I left graduate school, I just bought into all of that. And I think it just becomes a really deep part of your identity. So you become proud of your hard work and proud of your status and your and that identity that you've built up. And so, I subscribe to that. And I didn't grow up in a religious household. My mother was spiritual, but we didn't have any organized religion in the home. And I wanted to be an atheist because I felt like that's what science wanted me to be, but I could never quite say I was atheist because I knew that the tools of science weren't enough to prove or disprove anything existed, a higher power. So I was agnostic. I just kind of didn't really care one way or another. And that's just how I was. And I was very arrogant about it and really held it up as a shield, my identity, and was very, condescending to people who did believe in those things, because honestly, that's kind of the, I don't know what the right word is. I wouldn't say it's blatantly like this in academic science, but there's an undercurrent of that for sure running through it. Mm-hmm.
And yet your mother did coffee leaf readings.
Yes. And so as it goes with these things, it was personal experience that opened me up. I mean, if anyone had told me the story, and that's why in the book I make the distinction between new me and old me, because I still like to slip into my old identity and my old mind and imagine how she would have reacted to things. And if anybody had told her the story I'm about to tell you, she would have just rolled her eyes. But it was firsthand experience for me. So I'm Persian. So in our culture, as in many other cultures, we have a divination practice that uses coffee grounds. It's kind of like a thicker Armenian coffee that we use in a cup. So you drink the coffee, flip the cup, let the grounds dry. And then if you're lucky, you have somebody who can read them. And my grandmother used to read grounds for our family. I heard she was legendary. I never got the opportunity to have a reading. And then my mom inherited the skill, and my friends would come over every Sunday for these readings that they swore were really accurate. And our family members would always, during family parties, they wanted her to read for them. And when I was in graduate school, I would go home every weekend to see my parents, and because we were all in Los Angeles, and she started reading coffee for me. And at first it was just, a bonding thing, no big deal. But then she started saying things that I would notice would come true with really creepy accuracy. And so, being a budding scientist, I was still in my early years of grad school, I thought, let me just take notes and compare and see how they turn out. So I took notes for, ever since then, which has been over 15 years now. And I was in graduate school for 6 years. So over that time, by the end of it, it was undeniable. She was more right than she was wrong. She wasn't always right, but she was way more right than she was.
Statistically, yeah.
And that was the other thing. I was learning statistics in the meantime, and I had that in my mind. So I would always compare, like, is what she's saying for me? Could it apply to my friends' lives? Are theirs? Could they apply to me? If she had said this at a different time in my life, would it apply? And looking at through all those lenses, it was very specific to that person and that time in their life, and ultimately convinced me. And I just lived in this cognitive dissonance. I never tried to understand it through science, and I never tried to combine them. I just kept them separate in my mind. And went on.
You said in your book that you also had a Wiccan practice. What was that all about?
When I was in 7th grade, I think I was exploring, I guess, as you do at that age. And the internet was just coming online. And I think I don't really know what drew me to it or how I even thought of it. But I loved nature. I loved the moon. I love hiking. I still go hiking with my dad. And so I somehow came to know that, paganism or Wicca, like there are spiritual traditions that are more connected to nature than the main religions of the world seemed to be to me at that age. And I always loved magical, mystical things since I was a kid, and I was intrigued by that. So I went on the internet to read up about it, and I had this little, I wouldn't say it was consistent by any means. Like I wasn't doing every new moon or full moon ritual, but every once in a while I would, and it was also, I was a feminist. And so I liked the idea that there could be a god and a goddess, or just having female representation, in a higher power.
Well, you confess in the book that in the midst of a personal existential crisis, the mystical and the meaningful dimensions of life came fluttering into your world, but you pushed them away. In retrospect, do you think that something in your unconscious was pushing you to, become conscious about something bigger?
Yeah, actually, I've never thought about it like that, but
I mean, it seems like you have these little attractions that didn't fit in with everything, and yet.
Yeah, no, it makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
There definitely was a little bit of, again, like I said, I kind of, I said cognitive dissonance, but it was like there were two different parts of me. Like a part of me that was more, I loved fantasy and mystical, magical things and fiction and all of that. And then there was the very, hardcore analytical, technical science side. And they did feel very, very separate and distinct. And I do think that this path that I find myself on now is more of a merging. Like I feel more whole, or like I've merged both sides together. And yeah, maybe I like the way you phrased it. I mean, maybe there was something in me that knew that we should that I should combine the two sides, and that's what led me to all of this. Maybe, who knows?
So what events triggered your interest in spirituality? What made you decide that you were going to research this and research it very deeply?
Yeah. So what happened was I kept getting the readings from my mom, and there were a few events that I write about in the book that she, again, I mean, I had already belief in the coffee. It already worked, but there were big life events. Like somebody I know, one of my professors in graduate school, not while I was in graduate school, luckily, I had just graduated, but was killed by one of the students. And my mom had seen that in the cup for weeks in advance, but she didn't know all those details. She just kind of warned me, you're going to get really bad news, really, really bad news. And she's never said anything like that before. And it was just a very odd, like 5 or 6 weeks in advance of this terrible event that happened. And it really shook me to my core when it actually happened, because I just felt like, how could she have known? How could this be, this information be out here somewhere in the universe, accessible before it happens? And, could it have changed? Was it his fate or destiny? And that was one of the really the starting points. Like I kind of think of them like little seeds that were planted along the way. That was like the first serious seed. But I didn't do anything about it. It just kept me up at night and gave me existential anxiety, but I didn't do anything. And then a few years later, I had a relationship and it ended. And I think I just realized at that point that I wasn't happy. Like I needed that event to really make me realize how unhappy I was. And my mom had seen the outcome of that being positive, but that moment was when my existential crisis happened. And so I remember being like, how could this be positive? Why does it look so positive? The coffee is wrong, because I'm depressed and I'm every day wishing I wasn't born. So it's not positive. And so then that's when I got really interested in why is the coffee right and wrong sometimes, which of course in the long term it ended up being positive. But in the moment I couldn't understand. But that's what propelled me, was that moment of, is there fate and destiny? Do we have life plans, whatever? And then I started going to, my mom didn't have, answers. She doesn't know. She just gives you the reading. She doesn't really think about these things philosophically. But some of my girlfriends had gone to other psychics that they said were really good. Like the psychics would turn them away if they couldn't read their energy. And so for the first time in my life, I was at a low enough point where I was like, yeah, let's go to a psychic, which the science side of me was still horrified that I was doing it. But I was so desperate for answers. So my friends and I did this pseudo experiment where we went to a bunch of psychics, and we would swap them and then go over time to different ones, and we would compare the notes, kind of what I did mentally with the coffee readings. Because none of us were sure. Nobody knows for sure mainstream wise, if you don't dig into the literature, whether any of this is true or not. And so we did that kind of for fun, and I realized there's just no way these people knew things that were in like the deepest, darkest recesses of my mind that nobody else knew, and these like moments from my life that were not online, that were very private, that they could not have guessed, very specific things. And that really just, then the scientist in me woke up and was like, what is going on here? Yeah. We do not have a model for this. Like, we think time moves forward, but that's not what I'm experiencing. So I dug into the literature. I started reading, and I also started interviewing the psychics themselves, because I was curious to know how they felt, like the physical aspect of, are you feeling energy come in, or, how does it look like in your mind, or do you actually see it? Do you actually hear it? I wanted to know the physiology of it. Yeah. And that set me on that path.
Yeah, you went out and you interviewed behavioral health practitioners and scientists, didn't you?
Yes. Yeah. So scientists, I was just, as I was, reading these books and speaking with these psychics, intuitives, mediums, I kind of thought, what is science? Well, I know what science thinks about this, but what do my scientist colleagues think about this? Do they believe in anything spiritual or even paranormal? Like, we had never talked about these topics before, and I've known these people for over a decade. So I just got curious. I think I also wanted to know if I was crazy and stupid for even entertaining any of this. And so I just kind of called up some friends and was like, can I interview you? And can we talk about this? And they were really, open, and they were much more open-minded than I was. So I mean, through the project, I came to realize I was probably one of the most closed-minded people. So maybe I was a bad metric to hold everyone else to.
I mean, during those 2 years when you were diving into all of this research, was it a gradual dawning of an awakening, or did you have some pivotal aha moments that kind of catapulted the understandings for you?
So there was, when I started reading, I didn't mention this, but it also kept coming into my life in these synchronistic ways. So when I was getting the readings, it was kind of just for my own, before I started interviewing anyone, when I was just getting readings, it was kind of just, I don't know, casual exploration. And then I was listening to a podcast by Chelsea Handler, had written this book. She had a podcast, and she had Laura Lynn Jackson, a psychic medium, on. And then they mentioned this book, Many Lives, Many Masters, written by a psychiatrist. I had never heard of the book. They didn't say what it was about. They just said it was a case study. So I ordered it, not even reading the description. That was the first book that I read. And it was right in that point, but before I started the project, but after the readings, where I read the book, and I was like, what is this? This guy is like super smart. Went to Yale, went to Columbia, psychiatrist, chair of his department. And he's writing about how he stumbled across past lives in a regression session. And then the validation, and then he talks about the master spirits. And at that point, I really was, as my old me was very uncomfortable. I was like, what is this guy talking about? He's nuts. But then he just, the way he wrote it, it's a story, but the way he wrote about he was an atheist. He didn't believe in any of this stuff. He had great credentials. And so I just wondered if there were other people like him. And that book really, it was kind of a like, hey, there's this other really well-credentialed, allegedly respectable, prestigious, whatever words you want to use, person who had this like life-altering experience. Maybe there's something to it. Or even if it's not spiritual, I, as a scientist, interested in what is happening in that session, that is healing the person. And that was what I was interested in. The person was healed. And that to me is interesting, because I'm very interested in health and healing. So that started me. And reading all those books, I read all the past life regression literature, Brian Weiss, Roger Wolger, Michael Newton, and I started having just really a lot of synchronistic things happening in my life. And one of them was, which is just, it sounds silly, like still thinking about it, but I asked for a sign from the universe at one point, and every day was a mental battle of, you're stupid, this is stupid, obviously this isn't true, to being like, I don't know, like these people sound smart, their books sound, like it doesn't, when you read the work, it doesn't sound crazy. But I asked the universe for a sign at some point. I started, I don't know, I guess interacting with it because all the books said you could ask for signs. And so I started doing that, but I was never good at remembering what sign I asked for. And one day I was just like, okay, I'm just going to leave it up to the universe. And if I get this sign, like I'm really going to, look into this stuff. And I went to dinner 2 nights later with my friends, and Chelsea Handler was in the restaurant. And it was like chills from head to toe. My friends and I were just like staring at each other like, is this a joke? This feels like a cosmic joke. Like it was her podcast that, I heard the book, and that was what set me on this course. And it was just felt like a very meaningful sign. And
meaningful coincidence.
Yes. Yeah. Meaningful coincidence. And I live in LA and we see celebrities, but I've never seen her before or since. And it was just very meaningful. And so to get to the quote that you were asking about, like, I finally understood what that meant, because in science, they specifically teach you that the external world has no meaning. All meaning is created in your brain. And that's where I think a lot of scientists like myself struggle, because you keep thinking anything that happens, like even that night, you immediately start being like, well, you created meaning out of that moment, and it was just a coincidence. And that's a real struggle. But I do think that was a turning point for me, because it was just so powerful. It was just so powerful.
Aside from that moment, which, we call synchronicity, were there, what did you discover that excited you the most? I mean, there must have been something that really had you, wow.
Yeah, I think that it was that there had been so much research done on this phenomena, that it was replicable, that the US government had put money in, that the Russian government, that a lot of research had been put into this, and that it was actually really well established, really surprised me. I mean, that was another turning point where, that was more like, this isn't a meaning I'm creating in my mind. These are these scientific standards that we use in the lab. These are methods we use. These are the same statistical analyses we use. And in some cases, the sample sizes were larger. There were better studies than some of the ones, we do currently. So that really for me, I needed that. I needed science to believe, because I couldn't completely abandon that. So for me, that was amazing to see, and really kind of solidified in my mind that there is something real there, and that not only is it, meaningful and can, improve your life and your health, but it's also provable in some ways. But I also, in the conversations that I had later with some of the other researchers that I reached out to, I did come to understand that there is always going to be some element that you can't measure, or that isn't replicable. And I think that is a huge thing that I want to make sure I don't lose when I speak about this, because I do think scientists expect that, because I did expect that you can measure everything, and that you must, but I think it's important to remember that science is just a method, and that the world has no obligation to bow to our method, and that there's a lot of mysteries.
Yeah. So how did your discoveries, how did that journey transform your career?
Yeah. So luckily, this was in the throes of COVID. It started before COVID, but the deep research and interviewing happened during COVID, in any hours I could steal in the morning or after work or at lunch. And it did make my work start to feel not meaningless, but unfulfilling for me. More unfulfilling, actually. It was already feeling a little bit that way, much more unfulfilling. And I talk about in the book, I kind of had an identity crisis, and this wasn't helping because thinking about, okay, I built my whole identity around this scientific career. What am I going to do now? I'm not going to, I don't really want to go on and study this kind of whatever you want to call it, supernatural, paranormal things. But what do I do with this? But it did make me think about or realize immediately that the whatever I was doing wasn't fulfilling. And so I needed to address that immediately. And I think when I finished doing all the interviews, I had a mentor and reading. I had done so much. I learned so much. I had a mentor who encouraged me to just write it up for myself, to tie it all together. There were so many loose ends, so many questions I still had. He's like, oh, just start writing. You have so many notes, just type it up and see what happens. And it turned into a book.
It turned into your book. Yeah. Yeah. I want to ask you before we go to the break, how's your book been received by your former colleagues and fellow scientists?
Yeah. It's interesting. They're, like I said, they're more open than I was. So they're supportive. I will also say that they've opened their minds a lot. So I have a friend, I hope he doesn't mind me talking about this, but he was very skeptical. And we always, and I don't hold this against them because I did it too, we always look for physical explanations whenever we're talking or thinking about these events. And he would do that every time I would bring this up. And over these last 2-3 years that I've been going through this and updating him on everything, he's finally slowly opened up and told me some of his own experiences. And he gets it now. He gets how I think about it and how the evidence has swayed me. I wouldn't say that I'm, swaying everyone, but I think it's similar to my path where it's like seeds are planted. And it's kind of like that, like somebody plants a seed and you kind of mull it over in your mind.
So you're not being excommunicated?
Not yet.
Not yet. Oh. Okay, well, we're going to go to break now. You're listening to What is Going On. I'm Sandie Sedgbeer, and my guest today is cognitive neuroscientist, author, and entrepreneur Mona Sobhani, who was fully indoctrinated into the cult of science until a series of life-altering events caused her to reconsider spirituality and psi concepts. And we're talking about the book that resulted from those experiences, Proof of Spiritual Phenomena, a neuroscientist's discovery of the ineffable mysteries of the universe. We'll be back with more from Mona Sobhani after the break.
OMTimes TV. Imagine becoming a super influencer. Reinvent yourself, invest in your brand, and then manifest your success with a robust spheric approach. OMTimes Media and Broadcasting offers a unique and multifaceted way to become the spiritual and conscious influencer you deserve to be by putting your message across our powerful platform with its proven record of integrity and excellence. Through our produced shows, OMTimes offers the opportunity to become a sole TV personality, a radio show host, an magazine columnist, and indicated podcaster, all in one shot. By live streaming your show on OMTimes TV and broadcasting it across the extensive OMTimes radio and TV networks, you become more than a host. You become an ambassador and a force for positive change. OMTimes. Open yourself to the possibilities.
If I could be you, and you could be me for just 1 hour. If we could find a way to get inside each other's minds. Walk a mile in my shoes. Walk a mile in my shoes. Well, before you abuse, criticize, and accuse. Walk a mile in my shoes.
Welcome back. So, Mona Sobhani, you wrote about the dramatic healing effect of past life regression therapy. And just last week, I was talking to Dr. Linda Backman, who is a highly respected psychologist and regression therapist and author. And she told me that at least 50% of her clients are reporting past lives that did not occur on this planet. What's your view on that?
Yeah, I remember reading something like that in Michael Newton's books too.
Yeah, he was her teacher.
Okay, there you go. Yeah. I think that that's possible, probably. I mean, I also think so. I'm evolving, I'm still learning. I'm so new to this. I've only been reading these materials for a few years. And sometimes I think sort of the way I think about it is that, and they teach us this in science and neuroscience, that our brains are storytellers, and that we are interpreting something, information, energy, I don't know what it is. There's debate about that. But that I do think these energies come through us in stories. And so that's kind of how I think of it. I think people tend to get too caught up in, is it true? Is it real? Is it this past life for future? Again, with the, time is time a real construct, these kinds of things. And so I did too. And actually that's what set me on the journey. So I guess it's useful in that way, because you're like, wait, is there a past? Is there a present? Is there a destiny? Is there fate? Is there karma? Is there a reason I'm going through this? And I think those stories are very helpful, for life on earth. And I think for our journeys, and whether they're true or not, or real or not, I think probably we're asking the wrong question there. That's kind of where I am right now on that.
Yeah, well, I understand that. And I think that while we can't necessarily prove those, the one thing that we do have evidence for is that these people do heal.
Exactly.
When they have past life regression, whatever has been, the problem for them tends to go away. So,
yes.
Yeah. Okay. Well, you say that the mainstream Western, i.e. scientific materialistic worldview failed you, and likely it's failing many of us. So tell me a little bit more about that.
Yes, that has to go back to the meaning that we were talking about. So the scientific materialist worldview, kind of the Western worldview, which encompasses that paradigm, really has this belief that there is no meaning in the universe besides what is created in our brains, and that everything is random and meaningless. The universe is dead, particles are dead, everything's just, matter and physical matter, and that's it. And I think that can really, I think really living without purpose, which is a very well-known thing, apparently, which I didn't know because I was so steeped in scientific literature, but having purpose and meaning, and these narratives and these stories are extremely vital, actually, to, I think, our survival. Not like a nice, comforting story to have. Like, I think they're actually vital to life for humans. And I think that when we have that worldview of, everything is just random and meaningless, first of all, you're missing so much information around you that probably, I believe, is there to help guide you. But it kind of like extinguishes that fire in your heart, if you will, or your soul, whatever. But it just kind of extinguishes that vitality, thinking that there's no purpose to any of this, and that's actually what I found the most helpful for even before I got way into this, just reading some of the spiritual texts in the beginning. One of the most valuable things I got was that simple cognitive reframe of, instead of why is this happening to me, saying, what should I be learning from this? Like, this is for me. This is to help me get where I need to go. That simple reframe is extremely powerful. And, if you don't want to believe it, I mean, I actually believe it, but even if you don't want to believe it, the simple reframe from one question to the other is extremely helpful in for you getting through challenging times. But I think that I think there's a lot of meaninglessness. There's something called the meaningless crisis, and a lot of philosophers talk about it in this era, that we really disconnected ourselves from nature and from each other, especially with all our time on our screens. And so there's this sense of isolation, and then on top of that, the sense of that I was just born here randomly. This life has no meaning. I'm just here suffering, and there's no meaning to any of it. And it's just a difficult way to live. And that's what I think that's how, by the time I graduated with my degree, I believed that. And when I hit crisis points and challenging points in my life, having that kind of worldview was not helping me. In fact, it was making it worse. Like I would just feel more despair, more darkness. And then once I found this, spirituality, it turned out it had such value, because it turned that narrative around, and immediately, just again, like I said, that simple question can really lift you out of darkness pretty quickly. Is you think, well, it still sucks that I'm experiencing this, but okay, let's say it's for me. What can I get out of it?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I've been around long enough to have lived through the years when science absolutely would ridicule anything that was remotely spiritual. Now what we're beginning to see is that there is a bit of polarization there happening with many scientists who are opening up their minds. I mean, you produce a newsletter, a science-based newsletter, and you had an article on a scientist who is not a mystic is no scientist, in which you talked about the rumor that Francis Crick had been on an LSD trip when he had his novel insight into DNA with double helix structure, and other scientists who have actually taken psychedelics and had numinous experiences that have led to breakthroughs in their own work. So do you think that by and large, in your experience, having gone through the whole, academic career, that we are on the verge of a kind of new era where science is beginning to open its mind even more to the possibility of spirituality?
I do. I think that it's probably started in not the 70s. Well, maybe the early 90s or 2000s. There started being more research on meditation, which was, initially so much pushback, so much stigma. People would be embarrassed to say they work in a lab that focuses on meditation or consciousness. So I think that started to pave the way. And then in more recent days, the Psychedelic Renaissance, with exploration and scientific study of psychedelic, plant medicines, I think is throwing that door open even more. And I think just as you mentioned, personal experience, and it can come from both two sides. One, it could be personal experience with the substances yourself, or it doesn't have to be a substance either. Breath work can get you to a similar state. Personal experience with these, as I can attest to, will really shake your worldview. And then the other is just, again, watching the healing effects of these modalities in your patients. And what caught my eye with the psychedelic literature, which I was never interested in psychedelics. I too type A control freak to ever want to do that. But the literature caught my eye because you just don't see those kinds of dramatic effects, like changes in personality traits, which are usually very stable, changes in improvement in depression and anxiety, substance addiction in some cases. And obviously much more research needs to be done because these substances have been banned for so many years that research has really been hindered. But a lot of the work that's coming out, it's just very impressive. So I think that there's two sides to that. It's important to study them, possible healing effects. And then the flip side of that is also literally mind-altering, mind-expanding substances that will blow your worldview open. And I think psychedelics are so interesting for so many reasons, but for science in particular, I'm so excited to see this field come face to face with something like psychedelics, which just forces you to encounter the transcendent and the mystical, because it's part of the experience and it's part of what heals you.
Well, it's interesting that back in the 60s, Timothy Leary, LSD, a number of people, and Gene Houston was among them, were running experiments, and they were being funded to run experiments, but then it all got shut down, and suddenly, this has to disappear. And now here we are again with more and more research being done, and some very credible research being done at universities here in England, with mushrooms and depression, and the results so far are very interesting.
Yes, and it's they're, as I mentioned, they're much better than the standard of care. So for depression, for example, there's been studies comparing standard antidepressants versus psilocybin mushrooms, and showing that they're as effective, if not more effective, than standard antidepressants. And the thing with antidepressants is you have to take them every day. But with, at least in the studies with the psilocybin mushrooms, it's maybe 3 sessions. They're long sessions, like 6 to 8 hours with a therapist, very intensive. But, 1 to 3 sessions, you see drastic improvement in symptoms, as opposed to taking an antidepressant every day for the rest of your life, because it doesn't cure anything. It just suppresses symptoms. And same with anxiety, same with end-of-life anxiety with terminal cancer patients. We see they're exploring with LSD and all different kinds of psychedelics. So there's a lot of potential there. And it's very exciting times.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, in your article, in your newsletter, you talked about psychedelics driving creative breakthroughs in science and even flashes of genius. And of course, we know that many artists, many authors in the past, but you raised the question, how do these states improve the perception of meaning? What is the answer to that question?
Yeah, we don't know. And I actually, when I was writing this last week, 2 weeks ago, I was trying to look up the neuroscience of the construction of meaning in our minds. And it was a really diverse literature, not very good. I mean, if anyone is listening and knows of studies, send it my way, please. But I couldn't find anything. Because meaning comes from a lot of different things, right? Personal experience, tying it to a memory, tying it to what you value, tying it to your identity. There's a lot of different factors that go into that. So I didn't find anything satisfactory. But it does seem that from psychedelic treatment, finding meaning in something that happened to you or just in life seems to be part of what heals you. And so I am interested in that. And why, in that altered state, would there be an enhancement of realizing what the meaningful aspect behind the experience was for you, like how that occurs? Because, I think there might be, well, they're still working out models in the brain, but one theory is that it opens up connections and allows new and different connections than what your brain normally has to happen. And it's possible that that's where enhanced creativity and meaningfulness comes from, because you're just seeing new perspectives, new connections. But what I'm interested in is you're seeing improved meaning detection, not just different meaning. You're going from no meaning to meaning.
Yeah.
So, so hasn't been resolved yet, but hopefully as research progresses on the field, we'll get some answers.
Well, meaning meaning, I think, really is such a pivotal, important thing, because if we don't have meaning, then what do we have? I mean, you look at the success of Viktor Frankl's book on, In Search of Meaning, and meaning was what got him through, the worst experience one can imagine. I know that if the work I'm doing doesn't have meaning for me,
Yeah.
I'm in
Me
a
too.
funk, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it does seem to be a core aspect of our being, something that I think helps us thrive and flourish. It's an interesting question again as to why that is, why we evolved this way, or there's a lot of different ways we can look at it, but it's a really interesting question. It does appear from thousands of years of philosophy and poetry and now science and behavioral health, that having hope and something to look forward to, and finding meaning behind events really helps you live a happy, thriving life. And it's interesting to investigate that, or why would we have evolved this way, and leverage it. And that is kind of where your earlier question comes in of why is the Western worldview, or why is this scientific materialism harming us, is because it takes away that meaning. And it doesn't help us in our day-to-day.
So tell me a little bit about microdosing, because that's something that many, many people are embracing. We've been reading about that and its use in Silicon Valley in particular, for some years now. What are people experiencing with that?
Yeah, so microdosing is when you take a psychedelic substance. You're supposed to take it at a subsensory level, meaning that you're supposed to take such a small dose that you don't have those wildly different sensory experiences that you would on a full dose. And people report, and there's been studies, but there needs to be more research done on this. It hasn't been that well studied, but there are reports of people who do microdose. They report improved mood, decreased depression and anxiety, improved creativity, improved productivity, better ability to connect with other people emotionally, better ability to empathize, a wide array of effects. And it's basically taking just a very, very small amount. And there's a few different protocols. You can find them in my newsletter. I link to them, but you basically take it for a few days and don't take it for a few days, so that your brain doesn't stop producing its own serotonin, so it doesn't get used to the medicine. But you kind of alternate that way, and it allegedly improves, for some people, productivity, creativity, and all those things I mentioned. But what we don't know is a lot of things, such as if you have anxiety and depression, it works better for you or worse for you, how much you should take, what's optimal, if there really is an effect, or is it all expectancy, like kind of placebo effect type of thing. So more research needs to be done, but the people who do it swear by it. So there's something to be said for that. It does seem to be helping some people.
Well, on a personal level, I mean, you seem to have found new meaning in your life. You've created a newsletter that is a very interesting newsletter. What are your goals for that?
For the newsletter, it's honestly just for fun. I just like reading and writing about and thinking about not just psychedelics, but all of these things, psychedelics, breath work, past life regression, all of these kind of alternative, quote unquote, therapies that actually heal people. And now we have the studies to say, like, at the same level of antidepressants or better than other behavioral therapy techniques or whatever. So, they're actually helping and healing people. So they have value for society in that way. But then looking further at all of the interesting questions that arise, because again, this is like an intersection of science and spirituality, kind of these spiritual aspects, transcendent mystical aspects emerge from these experiences. And we have no explanation for them, but they seem to be part of what's healing you. And I just think that's really interesting. And I think that, at least for me with psychedelics too, I was so blown away by the literature. I just thought I have to share this, because I noticed as I was talking about it with people, they weren't familiar with it. And some of that stigma still survives from the 70s of, psychedelics, that's wild, and I kind of just wanted to dispel some of that and show the value in these medicines. And yeah, I've found them to be personally very very healing and very mind expanding. And I think they're great. So I just wanted to share that. I honestly just do it for fun, the newsletter.
So what are you doing in your daily life? What are your goals now?
Yeah. Well, the book comes out August 23rd. So I'm happy to get that out there. I'm still a neuroscientist. I work with technology companies to do virtual reality, mobile app companies. And I work on what we call behavioral design and also creating neural models for how technology is interacting with your brain or changing your behavior. So I do a lot of that. I have my own consulting company. And I'm also working on another company with two friends where we're going to kind of expand out those services. So I work at the intersection of neuroscience, health, technology, and spirituality now.
So what do you most want readers to take away from your book?
That we don't have all the answers. And that's okay, and that's really okay. But also it really is kind of written for people like the old me, and showing the struggle that I had, because I think I didn't find that in the books I read, and I thought I was the problem, or why couldn't I either just accept it or why couldn't I just debunk it? And so I tried to capture that middle ground of there's this evidence, but wait, aspect of the struggle, and ultimately coming to understand, the title Proof. First of all, the publisher chose the title, but it was a journey of me trying to find proof of spiritual phenomena. And, along the way, I just realized that there's so much more than that, like just accepting that some things are mysteries, just accepting that we don't know everything and we don't have explanations for everything. And finally, when I got to that, I didn't care anymore what anyone thought or what, scientific materialism said or anything, because you just suddenly realize all of that is limiting. All of that is within a narrative. And that you don't, all of that is part of something, but it's not everything.
Okay, I have to ask you this question as it's been in the news lately. You said that you are a consultant, you're working with technology, artificial intelligence, virtual reality. We've recently seen in the news a Google employee saying that one of their bots or something has consciousness, is sentient. What is your view on that? And do you think that we are opening up a can of worms with artificial intelligence?
Yeah, I think most people who work, although I shouldn't say this, but a lot of people who work with AI recognize its extreme limitations, and it's even if a computer answers questions and can make it seem like it's a human interacting with you, I think most people wouldn't actually think it's conscious. At least everyone who I've spoken to, those of us who work with AI, but I do personally worry about where it could go. I'm not worried about where we are right now, but there is kind of a black box element to AI, with any algorithm, any kind of machine learning algorithm, where it can learn on its own and evolve on its own. And I think there is a lot of work that needs to be done in making those things transparent, or, I don't want to say regulating it, but I think just a lot more academic work looking at that, because the unknown element, you never know, it can definitely evolve into something that is not to our benefit.
Well, human nature is such that we know whatever advancements we make, there's always someone who's going to want to take that advancement down a road that may not be in our best interests.
Absolutely. And actually, a lot of machine learning algorithms and AI, they're already being used. Like there's not a lot of people know this, but they're not like rigorously tested. They're not rigorously examined to make sure they're fair. And so a lot of those are just being created, sold to companies. Companies use them in making legal decisions or various other things that affect people's lives in very real ways. And there's no clarity behind how those things are making decisions, what data it's been trained on, whether it's unbiased and fair. A lot of that work has not been done. So that is a scary element of if it just continues to evolve further with no serious thought around studying them and a careful thought into how they're evolving, then we could be in trouble.
Absolutely. Careful thought indeed. I mean, we can't just go ahead and do things just because we can. We have to think about the consequences. I'm afraid we have to leave it there. Thank you so much for joining us today, Mona Sobhani.
Thank you for having
been good
me.
to have you.
Lovely time chatting with you. Thank you.
So, Proof of Spiritual Phenomena, a neuroscientist discovered the ineffable mysteries of the universe, is published by Park City Press, Inner Traditions. And for more information about Dr. Sobhani and her work, visit Mona Sobhani, PhD.com. MonaSobhani.com. I'm Sandie Sedgbeer, and I'll be back with another edition of What is Going On at the same time next week. Till then, it's goodbye from me.